Somewhere in a data file kept by the Census Bureau in Suitland, Maryland, there is a list the public never sees in full. It sits behind the surname frequency reports the Bureau does release, and it runs on a simple rule. If a last name does not reach a certain number of people nationwide, it gets pulled before publication. Not erased, not forgotten by the families who carry it, just removed from the version the rest of us are allowed to look at. 100 names that cleared that bar in 1990 and in 2000 no longer do in the most recent releases. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Some of those names sat comfortably above the line for 2 centuries before they started sliding toward it. Others were always close to the edge and finally tipped over. If your family has been rooted in this country for generations, there is a real chance your name is one of them, missing from a government file you never had a reason to check. The threshold itself is public information, even if the working list behind it is not. Starting with the 2000 census and carried forward into 2010, the Bureau only publishes counts for surnames with at least 100 people attached to them nationwide. Fall under that number and the name gets folded into a catch-all category, listed only as all other names, a statistical blind spot where privacy protection and a shrinking family line happen to land in the same place, indistinguishable in the public data from 1,000 other names that fell under the same line for entirely different reasons. The Bureau built the rule to protect individuals in small population groups from being identifiable by name alone, which is a reasonable goal on its own terms. The side effect is that a name can be thriving in the sense that every person who carries it is alive and well, and still vanish from the official picture of what America is named, simply because there are not enough of those people to clear the bar. A surname slips under that line for ordinary reasons, and the reasons compound on each other across generations. A run of daughters, in a naming system built around sons carrying the family name forward. A courthouse clerk who simplified a spelling on a deed or a draft card and never asked permission. A community that clustered around one mill, one mine, one stretch of coastline, and then scattered when the work dried up and the young people left for cities that had nothing to do with the name their grandparents carried there. None of these forces show up as dramatic events in a single year. They accumulate across a century, one household at a time, and the mechanism does not care why a count drops. It only counts what is left standing. The Bureau has followed some version of this rule since long before anyone thought to compare the files decade over decade. Earlier releases used a different cutoff, and the number itself has shifted more than once, as privacy standards tightened, which means a name that cleared the bar comfortably in one release can find itself sitting right on the line 20 years later, without a single dramatic event forcing it there. It simply happens the way erosion happens, one small family at a time, one generation that moved away or never had sons at a time, until the total finally dips below whatever number the Bureau has decided counts as too small to publish safely. Nobody outside the Bureau has the complete working list, and the Bureau does not publish it as a ranked countdown the way a leaked government document might. What genealogists and demographers have put together instead, by comparing the public releases decade over decade, and cross-referencing them against older census manuscripts, immigration records, and church registers, is a strong set of candidates, names present in one file and missing from the next, or names sitting close enough to the cutoff that another 20 years of small families and intermarriage would finish the job on their own. A handful of those names carry entire chapters of American history folded inside a single word, and most of the people who still carry them have no idea how close they are sitting to the edge of the count. Start with the trades because medieval England built a whole layer of its surname stock out of what a man did for a living, and some of those occupations vanished so completely from daily life that the names attached to them had nowhere left to renew themselves. Bowyer meant a man who made longbows, a trade that mattered enormously to a kingdom that fought most of its wars with archers, and meant nothing at all once gunpowder made the longbow obsolete by the 16th century. The name crossed the Atlantic with early colonial settlers, took root in Virginia, and later in the Carolina backcountry, and has been thinning ever since, because the occupation it describes stopped needing new tradesmen roughly 500 years ago, and the surname never had a reason to spread the way a name tied to a common, permanent trade, like Smith or Miller, kept spreading on its own. Lorimer sits in the same category, though it belonged to a narrower and more specialized guild. A Lorimer made the metal fittings for a horse's harness, the bits and buckles and stirrup irons that every working animal needed, a trade respected enough in medieval London to have its own livery company, and rare enough even at its peak that the surname never achieved wide distribution the way an ordinary blacksmith's name did. Families named Lorimer settled in the mid-Atlantic colonies in the 1600s and 1700s, and the census files from the last 2 decades show a name with a shrinking footprint, concentrated in a handful of counties resting close to the edge of the cutoff. Falconer belongs on the same list, and for a similar reason. A falconer trained and managed hunting birds for a lord's household, a position with genuine status in the medieval world and no equivalent occupation left in the modern one. The name survives today, mostly among descendants who no longer have any connection to the trade at all, which is exactly the condition that leaves an occupational surname with nothing left to draw new numbers from. None of the 3 families behind these names vanished. Their descendants are lawyers, farmers, teachers, people with no connection at all to bows or harness fittings or hunting birds, living under a name that has been running out of new bearers since roughly the time gunpowder made the whole occupation pointless. What all 3 names share is not rarity for its own sake. It is a trade that closed. When the occupation a surname describes disappears from the economy, the name loses the one thing that used to keep replenishing it. New men entering the trade in every generation, and passing the name to sons who stayed in the same line of work, often in the same town, for centuries. Once that cycle breaks, the name only shrinks. It has no mechanism left to grow. Welsh names followed their own version of the same pattern, tied not to a medieval trade but to a 19th century one. Welsh immigrants arrived in the anthracite coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania in large numbers starting in the 1840s, bringing mining skill that had few equals anywhere in the world at the time, along with a tradition of chapel worship and male voice choirs that shaped entire towns in Luzerne and Schuylkill counties for generations. Surnames like Probert, Cadwallader, and Bevan clustered so tightly around specific coal patches that a mine foreman could often guess a man's home valley in Wales just from the spelling on his payslip. Probert descends from the Welsh patronymic Ap Robert, son of Robert, flattened over centuries into a fixed surname, the way most Welsh names eventually were, and it stayed concentrated almost entirely within the coal counties where the original miners settled, never spreading the way an English surname carried by farmers across dozens of states would have. When the anthracite industry began its long collapse in the middle of the 20th century, the towns built around it emptied out just as fast as they had filled a century earlier, and the surnames that had defined those towns went with the people who left, thinning out across 100 different destinations instead of staying concentrated anywhere large enough to keep the count high. A name that once filled a church directory in a single Pennsylvania valley can now be small enough nationally to sit exactly where the Bureau's line gets drawn, its choir long since disbanded, and its chapel converted to something else entirely. A different kind of erasure runs through the German-American names on the list, and this one was not slow. It happened inside a few years, driven by fear rather than economics. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, German language and German identity became a liability almost overnight, in a country that had, up to that point, hosted the largest single ancestry group in America. Towns with German names got renamed. Hundreds of German-language newspapers, which had served immigrant communities for decades, shut down or switched entirely to English within a few years. School boards in several states banned German instruction outright. Sauerkraut appeared on restaurant menus as Liberty cabbage, and families who had spoken German at home for 3 generations stopped speaking it in public. A number of them went further and adjusted their surnames to something that read as safer. The translations followed a pattern well documented in the genealogical record. Muller became Miller, Schmidt became Smith, Braun became Brown, Koenig became King, Klein became Small or Klein. The households that made that switch are, by definition, not on the list of vanishing names, because their names survived by becoming something else entirely. It is the households that kept the original spelling, out of stubbornness, or distance from the worst of the anti-German sentiment, or simple attachment to the name a grandfather brought over from Westphalia or Bavaria, whose surnames are now the ones running thin in the public count. A compound German surname like Kleinschmidt, Smallsmith, carries both halves of that history in one word, the trade name that might have anglicized to Smith on its own, fused with a diminutive that made it distinctive enough for a family to hold on to, and rare enough now that a modest run of daughters-only generations could push it under the Bureau's line within a single lifetime. The irony sits close to the surface once you look at it directly. The families who anglicized under pressure a century ago protected their names from the very erosion now threatening the families who refused to. Miller is in no danger of disappearing from any census file. Kleinschmidt is exactly the kind of name a 100-name list like this one is built from. Family stories about surnames often point to Ellis Island next, and the story is almost always wrong in the same way. Immigration officials did not sit at a desk on Ellis Island rewriting names on a whim, inventing spellings because a clerk could not pronounce an accent. The names on file were the names already recorded on the ship's manifest, compiled at the port of departure in Hamburg or Bremen or Naples, and inspectors checked new arrivals against that existing list rather than composing new ones on the spot. Historians who have gone back through the manifests and immigration procedures of the period have found almost no documented cases of a name being altered at the inspection desk itself, despite how often the story gets repeated at family dinners as settled fact. What actually changed names was slower, and it happened after arrival, at a courthouse, at a school enrollment desk, at a naturalization hearing years later, when a family decided on its own that an easier spelling would serve its children better in a country that struggled to pronounce the original. That distinction matters for the surnames on this list because it means the family still using the old, difficult spelling made a deliberate choice, generation after generation, to keep something that would have been simpler to drop at any point along the way. A name like Grzegorczyk or Wojciechowski did not survive by accident and did not survive because a clerk failed to change it. It survived because somebody kept correcting the paperwork every time an easier version crept in. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Huguenots left behind a smaller, more concentrated set of names, and their history explains exactly why. France revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, stripping legal protection from French Protestants overnight, and roughly 200,000 Huguenots fled the country in the years that followed, scattering across Protestant Europe and the colonies. A portion of them landed in the English colonies, especially in South Carolina, where they settled around Charleston and became part of the colony's merchant and planter class within 2 generations, building rice fortunes and shipping houses alongside the English families already there. Their names still mark the Carolina Low Country today, though thinly. Huger, pronounced nothing like it looks on the page, belonged to a Huguenot family that became prominent enough in South Carolina to leave a hospital, a school, and several street names behind, and yet the surname itself sits deep in rare territory nationally, concentrated almost entirely in one state. Manigault follows the same pattern, a name tied to Charleston rice and shipping fortunes in the 1700s, still recognizable to anyone who knows Low Country history, and still small enough in total population that it hovers near the edge of what the Bureau will publish. Legare carries the same story in a slightly different register, a name that produced generations of South Carolina lawyers, planters, and politicians, and that has never spread meaningfully beyond a small circle of families descended from the original refugee line. These are not obscure families. Charleston's own historical societies still catalog their portraits, their church pews, and their shipping ledgers in detail. They built institutions that still stand. Their names simply never expanded beyond the region where the original refugees put down roots, and 2 centuries without new immigration from that specific French Protestant population left each surname with no outside source of new numbers to draw from. New Netherland produced a similar problem for different reasons. Dutch colonial families controlled a fair share of the Hudson Valley and Lower Manhattan before the English took over the colony in 1664, and many of those families kept their Dutch surnames for generations afterward, intermarrying within a relatively tight circle of old Dutch families across New York and New Jersey. Onderdonk is one of the surviving names from that world, attached to a family that held land in Queens and on Long Island from the 1600s onward, still findable in old cemetery records and street names across the region, and still small enough in total count that it sits close to the Bureau's cutoff today. Bogardus carries similar weight. It belonged to one of the earliest ordained ministers in New Amsterdam, a name embedded in the colony's founding religious history, and it persists today mostly among descendants who can trace an unbroken line back to Dutch New York, a population that was never large to begin with and has had 4 centuries to thin out through daughters, out-migration, and the ordinary arithmetic of family size working against it every generation. Genealogical societies devoted specifically to old Dutch New York families still exist, membership limited to documented descent from a small founding pool of colonial surnames, which tells you plainly enough how small that pool has become. A society built around proving a rare surname is itself a kind of evidence. The Acadians of French Canada were expelled from their homeland altogether, and the surnames that survived that expulsion carry the scar of it directly. Starting in 1755, British colonial authorities forcibly removed thousands of French-speaking Acadian settlers from Nova Scotia, an event still remembered in Acadian communities as Le Grand Dérangement, and scattered families across the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean. A large group eventually resettled in Spanish Louisiana, where the word Acadian slowly became Cajun, and the community rebuilt itself in the bayou country outside New Orleans. Some of the surnames carried into that resettlement, Broussard, Thibodeau, spread widely enough within Louisiana to stay well clear of the Bureau's cutoff. Others did not spread the same way. Melancon is a genuine Acadian surname carried by one of the original expelled families, still present in Louisiana parish records and church registers, and still small enough nationally that it sits inside the range genealogist's flag as approaching the threshold. Auquin belongs on the same list, a name tied to some of the earliest Acadian settlers in Nova Scotia before the expulsion, surviving today mainly within Louisiana and small pockets of Maine, with a total national count thin enough to be genuinely at risk. Louisiana's own vital records still separate Cajun surnames from Creole and Anglo ones in a way few other states bother to, a quiet acknowledgement that these names arrived as a single displaced population rather than through ordinary immigration. Native American surnames disappeared from the record for reasons that had nothing to do with the slow drift of ordinary genealogy and everything to do with deliberate federal policy. Beginning in the 1870s, government-run and church-run boarding schools removed Native children from their families and required them to take English first names and English or biblical surnames, part of an explicit assimilation policy designed to separate children from tribal language and identity as thoroughly as possible. Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879, described the school's mission in terms that made the goal explicit rather than implied. Eliminate the Indian, save the man. Original family and clan names were replaced in school registers, sometimes assigned from a list written on a chalkboard on a child's first day, and those replacement names, not the ones a family had carried for generations before, are what ended up on later census forms, land allotment records under the Dawes Act, and eventually birth certificates for the children born after. Some tribal surnames survived this process intact, where a community kept enough distance from the schools to preserve its naming traditions across the assimilation era. Others exist today only as the family name recorded at a single boarding school more than a century ago, carried forward by descendants who may or may not know that the surname on their driver's license began as a substitution rather than an inheritance. Where an original name did survive the boarding school era, it is very often small enough in total population to be one of the names now approaching the Bureau's suppression line, a double erasure in effect, once by federal policy, and now, potentially, a second time by simple demography closing in from the other direction. Enrollment records kept by individual tribal nations sometimes preserve a fuller picture than the federal census ever will, which is part of why genealogists researching native family lines are often told to start with the tribe's own rolls before turning to any federal document at all. The census counts what survives on paper nationally. It was never built to hold the version of the name a family kept alive at home, out of federal sight, long after the school register said otherwise. The surnames chosen by formerly enslaved Americans after emancipation in 1865 tell a related but distinct story of self-determination under enormous constraint. Freedom of choice mattered enormously in that moment, brief as the window sometimes was. Some newly freed people kept the surname of the last enslaver's household, for practical reasons tied to locating family members who had been sold away years earlier and might be searching under that same name across state lines. Others deliberately chose something else entirely, the name of an earlier enslaver from before a sale had separated the family, the surname of a black community leader or abolitionist they admired, or a name that stated the fact of freedom outright, like Freeman or Freedmen. Those chosen names spread through specific communities, often concentrated in the same county or parish where the family had been enslaved, and then scattered further during the Great Migration of the early and mid-20th century, when millions of black Americans moved north and west in search of work and safety. That scattering meant many of these surnames now show up thinly across dozens of states rather than densely in one place, which is exactly the pattern that erodes a name's total count even while individual families carrying it are thriving in every other sense. A surname can be meaningful, well-documented, and tied to a specific and deliberate act of self-naming in 1865, and still be small enough today to sit near the edge of what the Bureau will count. The Freedmen's Bureau's own registers from the years right after emancipation remain one of the only surviving records of that first choice, and genealogists still comb through them looking for the exact moment a family settled on the name it would carry forward, often the single most important decision that family ever made about how it would be known. The Gullah Geechee communities along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia preserved something rarer still: African naming traditions that survived slavery relatively intact because of the isolation of the Sea Islands, cut off from the mainland by marsh and tidal water for most of the year until well into the 20th century. Surnames in these communities sometimes carry direct linguistic roots back to West African languages, sitting alongside English surnames adopted after emancipation, and the entire population base is small enough and concentrated enough in a narrow coastal strip that even well-established Gullah family names run close to the Bureau's threshold nationally. Bridges built to the mainland in the later 20th century brought tourism, resort development, and out-migration to the islands, and each of those forces pulled a small population further from the concentration that had kept its surnames legible in the record for 200 years. Land that families had held since emancipation, often without formal deeds, came under increasing pressure from rising property taxes and resort development, and the families who left to preserve some other kind of security took their names into cities where nobody else around them carried anything close to the same one. A surname that once needed no explanation on a single island can require one everywhere else it landed. Sephardic Jewish families add one more thread to this same pattern, and theirs reaches back further than almost any other name on the list. Small communities of Sephardic Jews, descended from families expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century and later scattered through the Netherlands, England, and the Caribbean, established some of the earliest Jewish congregations in colonial North America, in Newport, Charleston, Savannah, and New York. Seixas is one of the surviving names from that founding generation, carried by Gershom Mendez Seixas, the first American-born Hazan and a figure present at George Washington's inauguration, and it remains a genuinely rare surname today, concentrated among a small number of families who can trace their line back to that same colonial congregation. Minnies belongs on the same list, tied to Abigail Minnies, among the earliest Jewish settlers in colonial Savannah, and equally thin in the modern count. Both names carry more than 200 years of continuous American history, and both are small enough that another few generations without new bearers arriving in any real number could see them slip below the line entirely. Unlike the Ashkenazi Jewish immigration that arrived in far greater numbers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and left common, well-distributed surnames across the country, the original Sephardic colonial families never had a second wave behind them to keep the count healthy. The line either continues through the same small circle of descendants, or it does not continue at all. What all of these names share, English trade names and Welsh coal town names and German holdouts and Acadian exiles and Huguenot refugees and Dutch colonists and native families and freedmen and Gullah islanders and Sephardic founders alike, is not fame or obscurity on their own terms. Every one of them was, at some point in its history, common enough within its own world to matter enormously. Common enough to fill a chapel, a coal patch, a plantation ledger, a ship's manifest, a mission school roll call. What they share now is a population too small and too specific to keep renewing itself against the plain arithmetic of intermarriage, migration, and time working steadily in one direction. The Census Bureau's rule is neutral about all of it. It does not know or care about the Edict of Nantes, or the Carlisle School, or the Great Migration, or Le Grand Derangement, or the closing of a Pennsylvania coal shaft. It only knows a count, and when the count drops below 100, the name goes dark in the public file, whether or not the people who carry it are still very much here, living ordinary lives under a name with an extraordinary history sitting behind it. You can check your own name against what the Bureau has already published. The most recent surname files are searchable for free through the Census Bureau's own website, listed under frequently occurring surnames. And if your last name does not appear in the current release, the way it appeared in an older file your family may have looked at years ago, that absence is not nothing. It is data, sitting in plain view where most people never think to look for it, easy to find once you know it exists and easy to miss for an entire lifetime if you don't. Compare it against a decade or two earlier, if the older files are still archived, and watch for the direction the number is moving rather than the number itself. A name can be small and stable for 100 years. It is the name that is small and still shrinking that belongs on a list like this one. If your name traces to one of the histories described here, an English trade guild, a Welsh coal valley, a German household that chose to keep the old spelling against every pressure to drop it, an Acadian exile, a Huguenot refugee port, an old Dutch river valley, a boarding school register, a courthouse in 1865, a sea island community that time nearly bypassed, or a Sephardic congregation older than the country itself, you are one of the people keeping a small piece of that history countable, whether you ever think about it or not. Whether the Bureau keeps counting it much longer depends on nothing more complicated than how many of you there still are, and how many more generations decide the name is worth keeping, and worth spelling the way it has always been spelled, letter for letter, the way somebody first wrote it down. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.